"Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to put the shed down." The cop, Officer Martinez, fresh-faced and already looking like he'd seen too much weird stuff for a Tuesday, had one hand shielding his eyes from the rising sun and the other just barely touching his holster, less out of threat and more out of sheer exhaustion, like he was trying to figure out if he was still dreaming. Behind him, I had a whole damn line of lawn chair spectators, sipping lukewarm coffee and whispering like this was the 4th of July parade. Except our float was a creaky, 40-year-old wooden shed on repurposed trailer wheels. And somewhere, muffled inside that slowly moving wooden box, the desperate screams of Eleanor Vance, the self-declared empress of our HOA, were rattling the walls. And there I was, Jake Dalton, sitting high on my grandpa's old Ford tractor, hauling the whole contraption across the cul-de-sac like it was Noah's Ark, and we were escaping a suburban flood of bureaucracy. Pause for effect, music shifts slightly. It wasn't supposed to go like this, not even close. Just 10 days earlier, things were calm as they could be in Oakhaven Estates, a neighborhood built on manicured lawns, 2-car garages, and 1,000 pages of tightly wound HOA regulations. That Tuesday morning, I was out with my dog, Rocco, sipping coffee, enjoying the sunlight filtering through the old oak trees. Birds chirped, the mailman waved, and then I saw it. An envelope. Thick. Certified. That ominous, embossed HOA seal stamped on the front like some kind of medieval curse. My stomach clenched before I even touched it. I just knew. We'd been through the drama before. A fine for having inconsistent mulch coverage. A warning for overly enthusiastic Halloween lights. But this felt like an escalation. I called for Sarah. She was in the kitchen, arguing with our smart speaker, trying to teach it not to play boy band music every time she sneezed. When she saw the envelope, she froze mid-toast. The letter was signed by Eleanor Vance herself, a woman who saw her volunteer position as a divine mandate for suburban conformity. It claimed our shed, my late grandfather's shed, was an egregious violation of HOA Article 9C, Section 4.1, or whatever string of numbers she'd conjured up, because its rustic construction and unsanctioned aesthetic disrupted the neighborhood's visual cohesion. Visual cohesion. I read that line 3 times just to make sure. We had a neighbor down the street who parked a 12-foot inflatable pirate ship in his yard for 7 months a year, but our shed was the problem. Sarah poured me more coffee, which I promptly spilled onto the letter. Rocco licked it up. Maybe the HOA would fine us for dog spit on certified mail, too. See, the shed wasn't just a shed. It was the last thing I built with my grandpa, before his arthritis got so bad he couldn't hold a hammer anymore. It's a creaky pine fortress, with a tin roof that sings when it rains, and an old horseshoe nailed above the door for luck. Inside, it's all old tools, my childhood lawnmower, coffee cans full of mystery screws, and more memories than dust. That place smelled like motor oil and history. I couldn't let them take it. So we went to the HOA meeting. I wore my cleanest denim shirt. Sarah prepped a bullet point speech. We walked into the community hall like we were facing a parole board. Eleanor sat at the center of a long table, flanked by her 2 faithful lieutenants. Gary, who once tried to ban bird feeders for aesthetic pollution, and Patrice, who reported a retiree for having too many garden gnomes. They didn't smile. "We're not here to argue," I said, trying to keep my voice even. "Just to understand. Your shed violates the aesthetic regulation code," Eleanor said, tapping her clipboard like a judge passing a death sentence. "It does not adhere to the modern architectural standards of Oakhaven. You have 10 days to remove it, or we will file for compulsory removal and fines. It's part of the property. It's been there for 40 years, since before the HOA even existed. It's not hurting anyone." Sarah chimed in, her voice strained. Eleanor leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with that cold, bureaucratic hunger. "This is a community of standards, Mr. Dalton, not sentiment." I almost laughed. Almost. Instead, I looked at Sarah. She looked at me. And that's when the idea, the brilliant, terrifying, and utterly absurd idea, began to flicker. If they wanted to take it, fine. But they'd have to catch it first. Back at home, I walked out to the shed, put my hand on its old wooden frame, and whispered, "We're going for a ride, old friend." The next few days were a montage of absolute mechanical madness. I called my neighbor, Wes, who hadn't shaved since the invention of the internet, and owned every piece of heavy machinery known to man, including the old Ford tractor. He showed up wearing welding goggles and flip-flops, holding a wrench like a wizard's wand. "What's the job?" he asked, eyes twinkling. "We're going to make the shed mobile," I said. "Where to? I'll figure that out later. The important thing is away." Wes smiled like I'd just handed him a winning lottery ticket. We looped in Maya, a robotics prodigy from down the street, who built drones out of recycled toaster parts. And then there was Brenda, a former HOA board member who had been exiled after voting against a controversial mailbox repainting ordinance. Brenda, thankfully, brought blueprints and a vendetta. Within 48 hours, we had a plan, codenamed Operation Rolling Sanctuary. But first, we needed solid intel. Sarah and Maya bravely infiltrated the next HOA subcommittee meeting, disguised as overly concerned citizens. Sarah wore a terrible fake French accent. Maya carried a clipboard and introduced herself as Linda. They took notes, snapped photos, and discovered the shocker. Eleanor was planning a surprise inspection. Not in 10 days. In 3. We had to accelerate everything. That night, Wes and I worked under the moonlight, jacking up the shed. It creaked like a dying whale. We bolted repurposed trailer wheels from an old flatbed underneath the frame, reinforcing the base with enough angle iron to confuse any magnet. When we finished, it looked less like a shed and more like a medieval siege engine on training wheels. The trial run was a disaster. I fired up the tractor and eased forward. The shed moved 3 inches, then tilted violently like it had just remembered gravity existed. Screws popped. Wes shouted, "Abort! Abort! We have structural failure." The shed held together, barely. Sitting on an upside-down bucket, drenched in sweat and despair, Sarah brought me a lemonade. No words, just that soft, reassuring hand on my shoulder. "Are we completely crazy?" I finally asked. "Yes," she said. "But we're right." We had 48 hours left. The plan was now this. When Eleanor arrived for her surprise raid, we'd stall her and her lieutenants inside the shed long enough for me to hook up the tractor. Once they were locked in, we'd tow the whole thing across the yard, down the cul-de-sac, and straight into legal ambiguity, where the city street ended and the HOA covenants crumbled. High risk, higher reward. The conflict wasn't just about wood and nails anymore. It was about defining the boundary between community standard and personal memory. And I was ready to defend that memory with heavy machinery. It started with a sandwich, specifically a ham and cheese that Wes brought over in a greasy napkin while I was underneath the shed, trying to weld a makeshift axle bracket using a rusted lawnmower blade in pure desperation. "You're going to want protein," he said, handing it to me like it was battlefield rations. By this point, the whole crew was all in. The contraption was now referred to as the Liberty Shack. Maya, our teenage engineering genius, had started sketching possible paint jobs for it, most involving flames, lightning bolts, or the phrase "come and take it" in neon green. Sarah, meanwhile, had evolved from worried wife to tactical logistics coordinator. She created a wall chart with color-coded sticky notes, mapping out HOA surveillance windows, neighborhood traffic patterns, and peak pedestrian activity. I hadn't seen her this focused since she built an entire Jurassic Park dig site for our nephew's birthday party. But we had a major problem. Eleanor wasn't coming alone. The entire HOA board was scheduled to accompany her, clipboard and camera in hand, ready to document any unauthorized modifications. If they saw so much as a single trailer wheel under that shed, they'd call code enforcement and bury us in fines. That's when Sarah had her masterstroke. She called it Operation Barbecue Diplomacy. "We're throwing a massive, spontaneous, heavily publicized, neighborhood-wide barbecue," she announced, "with pulled pork, music, and a bake-off. If the HOA is stuffing their faces, mingling with neighbors, and smiling for the press, they can't inspect anything, especially not a shed that mysteriously disappears while they're eating deviled eggs." Wes clapped like she'd cured the common cold. Maya replied, "Can we have a drone show?" "No," Sarah laughed. "But we can have a raffle." And just like that, the mechanics militia became event planners. Brenda managed to convince the local news station to send a reporter, claiming a story about community resilience in the face of bureaucratic overreach. I didn't care what she told them. She somehow got us a massive bounce house for the kids for free. Meanwhile, Maya installed the hidden camera inside the shed, a GoPro buried in the corner behind an old rake. wired to stream directly to her laptop. If Eleanor sniffed around, we'd have footage. But Wes had added the real surprise, the motion sensor he'd rigged to play a voice loop. Why? I asked. For effect, he replied. The effect was a pre-recorded loop of my grandpa's scratchy voice from an old VHS tape, saying, "Now, son, don't forget to check the oil. Gotta keep the tools clean, always." When the motion sensor picked up movement, the voice played from a hidden radio speaker. "Do you think that's too creepy?" Sarah asked. "Yes," I said. "Perfect," Wes answered. By noon of the inspection/barbecue day, our backyard looked like a tailgate party had collided with a block party and gotten married at a farmer's market. People showed up in droves. Most didn't know the reason, but they heard there was pulled pork and potato salad, so they came with folding chairs and Tupperware. The smell alone was enough to lure in half the neighborhood. Eleanor arrived precisely at 1 p.m., clipboard in hand, sunglasses on, her mouth pinched like she'd just swallowed vinegar. She gave a tight, unnatural smile to the camera crew. Brenda met her at the edge of the lawn and immediately launched into a mind-numbing conversation about zoning policies and potential tripping hazards. As expected, Eleanor's eyes kept darting toward the shed. It was still standing in the backyard, freshly painted and adorned with 2 tasteful flower pots. It looked innocent, too innocent. Then she made her move. She walked briskly toward the shed and reached for the handle. Wes and I locked eyes from across the yard. He gave a subtle thumbs up. I sprinted toward her with a plate of brownies, yelling, "Eleanor, you simply must try these. They won second place at last year's bake-off." She ignored me, yanked the door open, and stepped inside. The door closed behind her. That's when Maya hit the speaker. "Check the oil, son. Gotta keep the tools clean, always." Grandpa's voice echoed faintly through the wood. We watched through the GoPro feed as Eleanor froze, her eyes wide, spinning slowly like she'd stumbled into a haunted barn. From the outside, nothing seemed unusual. From the inside, she was clearly rattled. She shouted for her lieutenants to come inside. That was the mistake. Gary and Patrice, bless their clipboard-carrying hearts, followed her in. Wes slipped behind the shed and jammed the latch closed with a heavy metal wedge. 3 in, he whispered. 0 out. Sarah checked her phone. "We've got 30 minutes, Jake. Let's move." It was time. The barbecue was at peak distraction. The HOA was trapped inside a creaking wooden cube, disoriented, and probably arguing about who brought the Ouija board. I climbed into the tractor. My heart was pounding, my hands trembling slightly on the wheel, but the sight of the GoPro feed, Eleanor holding her clipboard like a shield, yelling about structural violations, gave me the adrenaline I needed. Wes gave me the signal. The engine roared to life, and slowly, inch by inch, the shed began to move. It groaned like a reluctant beast, rolling forward on its repurposed trailer wheels. Thick black smoke puffed from the tractor's exhaust. For a moment, I thought the whole thing might tip over and crush Sarah's beloved flower beds, but it didn't. It moved, slow and steady, a strange, wooden monolith inching its way toward the front of the yard, while 3 members of the HOA screamed from inside. The barbecue crowd barely reacted, still laughing, munching, and playing cornhole, perhaps sensing something wonderfully absurd was happening and not wanting to ruin it by asking questions. Sarah stood near the refreshment table, microphone in hand, announcing raffle winners as if nothing unusual was occurring. Inside the shed, the chaos was beautiful. The motion sensor was still triggering every few seconds, and Grandpa's voice echoed over and over. "Always check your blade before a cut. Clean blade, clean job." It sounded vaguely threatening in context. Then came the real hiccup. Officer Martinez. The one I saw that morning. He rolled up slowly. Someone must have called in about the noise or the smoke. He got out, scanning the scene, then focused on the shed, which was creeping down the driveway like a determined tortoise. He walked up to me, hand resting lightly on his belt. I killed the engine and tried to look innocent. "Morning, Rick," he said. "Morning, officer. Got to ask, what exactly are you doing here?" I didn't hesitate. "Temporarily relocating a structure for property maintenance purposes." He stared at me, face unreadable. Then he looked at the shed, which was vibrating slightly as Eleanor pounded on the inner walls. "Is that Eleanor Vance in there?" "Yes, sir." "And you are moving her?" "Yes, sir." "Voluntarily." She walked involuntarily. The movement, however, is technically involuntary. He paused, rubbed his chin, and then, to my absolute shock, he sighed and said, I'm going to get a cup of lemonade and pretend I didn't see anything for the next 10 minutes. Sound fair? I nodded. Perfectly fair. We were halfway down the street now. I started the tractor again and carefully maneuvered the shed across the sidewalk and onto the pavement. Neighbors clapped. Kids threw confetti. Rocco barked like a cheerleader. But Eleanor wasn't finished. We heard her yell something that sounded suspiciously like federal action, followed by the unmistakable sound of her stilettos banging against the shed's walls. She was threatening litigation with a furious volume usually reserved for failed Broadway auditions. Then came the twist. Brenda ran up to me, pale, phone in hand. Jake, we have a real problem. Channel 7. The news crew, they just showed up. Eleanor called them earlier today, claiming she was giving them a property values preservation tour. I looked up. A van with a satellite dish was pulling to the curb. A reporter jumped out, camera rolling, eyes wide at the sight of a mobile shed trembling through suburbia. Can you stall them? I asked. No, Brenda said, grinning fiercely. But I can feed them a better story. She marched over to the crew and launched into a passionate, dramatic retelling of how the HOA had illegally trespassed, violated homeowner rights, and was now refusing to leave private property. The camera stayed trained on the shed. Meanwhile, I took the final, exhilarating turn onto the side road near the edge of our neighborhood, where HOA jurisdiction technically ended and the city easement began. The air smelled like freedom. And then, the latch gave way. Eleanor burst out of the shed like a banshee in a pantsuit, followed closely by a dizzy Gary and a nauseous Patrice. Eleanor's hair was wild. Her blouse was wrinkled. She pointed directly at me and screamed, You'll pay for this. This is a federal offense. I was still sitting on the tractor. Pretty sure it's not, I replied calmly. She instantly realized the news camera was rolling and tried to frame it as a hostage situation, but the footage of her entering the shed on her own kind of ruined the dramatic tension. Patrice threw up in the grass. Gary sat down on the curb and started Googling how to quit an HOA. We stopped the shed at the edge of town. The whole contraption hissed and groaned to a halt. I got down from the tractor, legs shaking, but heart proud. Sarah ran up and hugged me tight, warm, full of disbelief, and utterly triumphant. The news crew swarmed us, but it didn't matter. The story had already written itself. A man defied his HOA. A community backed him. And a shed took a ride. Music shifts to a reflective, resolved tone. The quiet that followed was the kind you feel right after a car crash. The air was heavy with dew, but also with anticipation. Across the yard, the Liberty Shack sat like an old war tank at the edge of the cul-de-sac. We both knew the HOA fury wasn't over. Eleanor had contacted 2 lawyers and left a voicemail for the homeowner's insurance office asking if hostile architecture was covered under liability clauses. But we had a counteroffensive ready. Sarah had printed every HOA bylaw Eleanor had violated. Brenda drafted a formal complaint accusing Eleanor of illegal entry, harassment, and misuse of authority. Wes made a spreadsheet that looked impressive. Maya, meanwhile, had edited the shed journey footage into a viral 4-minute highlight reel, complete with dramatic music and slow-motion shots of Eleanor screaming. She uploaded it under the title Shed Happens, the HOA edition. It had 30,000 views by the time of the emergency meeting. We arrived at the clubhouse to a packed house. The tension was thick, but beneath it was a palpable curiosity. Eleanor, freshly ironed, sat at the head of the table. She launched into a quivering speech about community standards, mutual respect, and the sacred duty of uniformity. But when she got to the part about reckless homeowner behavior resulting in loss of HOA dignity, someone in the back, I swear it was Wes, coughed very loudly, and it sounded exactly like a laugh. Then it was my turn. I didn't use notes. I talked about the shed, what it meant, and how we drove the final nails. I talked about fairness, about absurdity, and how the people who enforce rules should follow them first. Then Maya connected her laptop to the projector. The room went dark, and the highlight reel played in full, glorious surround sound. Eleanor's voice cracked as she screamed about bylaws while being gently rolled down the street in a haunted wooden cube. By the time the video ended, half the room was trying not to laugh, and the other half was just clapping outright. Eleanor stood up, eyes wide. This is character assassination. Brenda stood right after her, arms crossed. No, this is accountability. Then, Gary, one of her lieutenants, the one who looked pale and nauseous after the ride, leaned into his mic and muttered, "I'd like to file a motion for Eleanor Vance's resignation as HOA president." The gasps echoed across the room. A vote was called. One by one, hands went up. When it was over, the tally was clear. Eleanor was out. Her pearls snapped as she stormed out, beads bouncing like tiny declarations of defeat across the floor. Brenda was elected interim president. Her first act was to suspend all fines. Her second was to amend the bylaw that targeted the shed, adding a clause about grandfathered historical structures of personal significance. She called it the Walton Amendment. The story wasn't just about a shed anymore. It was about whether a community could make room for a man's memories. The final ruling came a few days later. The shed was exempt from retroactive enforcement. The attempt to seize it was declared improper, and the shed was now officially recognized as a structure of personal historical significance. Eleanor left town, citing stress and migraines. It was later revealed she took a job at a retirement community HOA in Florida, where she was reportedly already trying to ban flamingos. Brenda rewrote the rule book, replacing the absurdity with something called the common sense clause, which basically said, don't be a jerk and don't waste the board's time unless someone's house is literally on fire. I declined the offer to become vice president. Instead, I proposed we form the Fix-It Collective, an informal, neighbor-run committee focused on helping people fix things around their homes without being cited. Wes became our mascot. Maya drew the logo. Rocco wore the first branded bandana. The shed sits back in its original spot now, a little crooked, a little creaky, but utterly immovable. People still stop by to see it, to take pictures, to ask about the story. It's an anchor, a quiet, stubborn symbol. I sat on the steps with Sarah as the party wound down that summer. I thought about Grandpa, hoping he was proud, not just because we saved the shed, but because we saved the neighborhood from itself in the process. We didn't just protect a building, we built something else. A sense of place. A reminder that rules should serve people, not the other way around. So tell me, have you ever had to pull out the heavy machinery to fight bureaucracy? When is it right to break the rules to stand up for something that truly matters? Was my act of involuntary shed relocation brilliant, or was it just plain wrong? I want to know what you think. Drop your wildest HOA stories and your thoughts on shed justice in the comments below. Like this video if you believe a man has the right to tow his memories across the street. Subscribe for more stories about fighting the good fight, and hit that notification bell, because sometimes the dumbest, simplest things turn out to be the ones most worth fighting for.